好，我们第6场即将开始了。我们非常荣幸呢，可以邀请到2位欧洲大师级的人物，Kelle Baas-Schwegler and Evelyn Van Kelle。他们关注呢很特殊的领域，叫做 social technical。那它是强调组织的技术与人的因素的最佳的结合。那透过这样子的方式呢，可以重新设计完成的工作的方法。今天呢，他们将为我们分享 Autonomy is not what we really want， 如何保持团队组织的联系，以及保持自主性的同时平衡个人的需求。现在就让我们欢迎 Kelle Baas-Schwegler and Evelyn Van Kelle. Now, let us take the warmest applause to welcome Kelle Baas-Schwegler and Evelyn Van Kelle.
Thank you. Yes. So unfortunately, Evelyn couldn't be here today. And while I start talking, I'll start to share my screen. So yes, Evelyn is struck ill this morning. So unfortunately, she cannot come. So all the best to her. And let me get the chat up as well. So if you have questions or comments during this talk, I'll see the chat and maybe I can react to it. So today will be a talk about autonomy. Is that what we really want? And I'm really humbled to be back at DDD Taiwan for the 2nd year, and I really like it. Unfortunately, not in Taiwan. My wife would have really loved it. She is addicted to bubble tea. She really wants to go there one day. So hopefully next year we'll go there. So talking about that, let me share a personal story first. So me and my wife recently moved houses. It was around in the neighborhood, and yeah, we moved. Our main goal is to live close by her parents. Also, my parents live close. For us, it's important to have family close to us. And the added benefit is, since my mother-in-law comes from Asia, she gives us a lot of food, which is also important to us. But we moved houses recently, and earlier this year. And if you look at autonomy, you would think, well, I have a house now. I can do whatever I want on that house, which unfortunately is not the case. If you look at my garden here in the back, right, and there's a carport, you would say, well, let's just add more garden to the carport, and I have a bigger garden. Well, unfortunately, this neighborhood got designed 10 years ago. There was an architect along with the authorities here, and they say in the contract that this carport needs to be able to hold 1 car. Why? Because if everyone would have do this in the neighborhood, there won't be enough car spaces left. So, you know, if you talk about autonomy, are we now really autonomy with our own house? No. So if we would have moved to, well, a more rural area in the Netherlands, then of course, maybe we have more autonomy. But in this case, is autonomy what we really want? Because in this case, for us, it's live close to our family. Now, and of course, I have cats. So are we truly always autonomous? Well, we have a cat door here, right? So we need to abide by our cats because, well, eventually they're in control usually. So, but to describe and move on with autonomy, we need to, well, define it a bit. So autonomy is described by Mr. Pink as the urge to direct one's own life without the ability to control what, when, and how we work and how and who we work with. We'll never be completely motivated to complete the task. So that's autonomy, right? And within the domain-driven design scene, autonomy is, well, when you look at the bounded context pattern, right? Autonomy is a big thing. But we're lacking mastery and purpose there, and we're so focused on that autonomy. So Mr. Pink, in his book Drive, describes autonomy as direct one's own life. Now, could we actually ever be completely autonomous and completely control and have the ability to control what, when, and how we work? Now, if you will ask the philosophers, and if Romeo would watch this, he would agree, then we're born free, but the first thing is our parents, right? Our parents control us and we follow the instruction, retaining only in some cases. But this is a big philosophical question that we're not going into today, because that will take weeks, maybe months, maybe years, maybe never to solve. So autonomy in here is, well, there's an illusion of autonomy. Now, if you look at the definition, it's the quality of state of being self-government, especially the right of self-government. The territory was granted autonomy. So if you look at the dictionary, autonomous sounds like self-directing freedom and especially moral independence, personal autonomy. Now, if you look at my house where I live, do I have the autonomy to do that? No, I haven't, because I'm part of a village here. So I'm not autonomous, right? And that's the thing with autonomy. If we look at software development, and here you have Jape and Mark saying, I hate the word autonomy, right? It's individuating. I have no right to make my own decisions. That's what we hear. I have the right to make my own rules. And when we look at domain-driven design and software development, is that truly what we really want, that autonomy? Of course, we want some self-organization, self-government, but do we truly want autonomy? Because in this case, in my opinion, autonomy can be compulsive, right? A goal on its own instead of a means to an end. But autonomy in isolation is not enough. It's part of a bigger context, like my home I'm living in now, right? It's part of a bigger context. I have neighbors. I have people living in this village, so I cannot really do what I want. And the same goes for software development, right? In software development, I'm building software with my team, preferably, and of course, I cannot do what I want. And that's the polarity here that we're going to talk about. That polarity is between isolation and connectedness, right? Us, me versus we. And autonomy is on that scale. And every time we need to decide and balance these two things, right? So autonomy is that bulk concept that we use as we please, but the concept needs granularity. It means different things on different levels. Well, we're doing DDD workshop and we face the importance of language and meaning all the time, right? So we want to be exact on the word that we use. What does it mean? And it's no different for autonomy when we're going to use it. Autonomy defines boundary on multiple levels, and that's why we're here today. We want to dig into this concept, see what it means on different levels, tell stories about what we've seen in organization and teams and how autonomy can be misused, misinterpreted, and be a risk. For the record, we're not saying autonomy is bad. It might come across that way now, but that's not the case. Autonomy is brilliant when we all know within our relevant boundary what it means and applies. So we will share some learnings and observation. Well, Evelyn's not here, so I'll take over for her. And that we think we might help you in defining these boundaries more effectively. So where do we actually need autonomy? Lots of teams and people state that we want to be self-organizing and or self-steering, both marked as autonomous. But there's a difference here. You can be self-organizing. I can self-organize my house, but it still requires steering, right? The government here steers me. It happens all the time. Teams asking for vision from leadership. Please don't interfere with how do we do things here, but let us know what the end goal is, where you want to go with this company. So the first question is, where do we need or want autonomy and how much do we want it, right? What's the scale? And that comes into defining boundaries. Well, we're in a domain-driven design conference and boundaries are like one of the core concepts in domain-driven design. These boundaries are hard to define when we stick with the bold concept of autonomy. That's why we dive into different levels with pitfalls and opportunities. But first, let's visualize this polarity between connectedness and, of course, the other one, which is the part and the whole, right? So this is what we're going to talk about. Autonomy is part of this scale between that part and a whole. In system thinking, you have it, right? Part and a whole, and what connects me with these things. And this is a lemniscat, right? It has both upsides and downsides between the two. Yeah. So if you look at the part is the I. It's the more autonomy way, right? You have uniqueness, but you always also have isolation. Now, if you look at the whole, like being part of a whole, being part of a team, you have connectedness. But the danger there is also sameness, right? There's no uniqueness anymore in it. And this is what we need to manage. And this is what we're going to go into. Now, first thing, also, we talk a lot about polarities with Gien. It's a friend of ours, and she has this nice fun fact intermezzo. So the lemniscat you just saw in the middle, right, comes from the Latin word lemniscatus. What does it mean? So I give you 10 seconds. Is it round corners decorated with hanging riggers or the devil's curse? So use the chat and I will see. Maybe someone has an answer. So let's see. So is it round corners decorated with hanging ribbons or the devil curse? So anyone has an idea? I don't see anything in the chat. So I'll just say it's decorated with hanging rhythms. Some people say it might be the Devil's Curse, but it's not. So let's continue with the talk. So today we're gonna talk, or I'm gonna talk about 4 levels of autonomy. Yeah. So the first level is autonomy in code. I'm gonna clearly go inside code because there's this lemniscate as well. And then we go to teams, then we go between teams, and then we go in organization. And if you look at domain-driven design, this is the full area domain-driven design entails, right? It's the whole thing we do for software. So let's go to autonomy in code. And there's no silver bullets and golden hammers. That's what I would like to start with, right? There's no one way of doing things because it's that balance, that tight balance that we need to create. So when I started coding, I came into a team and, well, proper unit testing was a thing. We needed to do proper unit testing. But back then I saw this unit test as, well, I have a Java class in this case, and then I create one unit test for that class, right? It's always one-on-one, one class, one unit test. And what happened is that at some point I find myself creating a lot of mocking, stubbing, faking in all these unit tests. And that's only one strategy we picked, right? One-on-one, an isolated strategy. So we isolated these all, but there was no connectedness between the classes, and the classes should actually represent units where there's a form of autonomy and isolation. So Martin Fowler recently put out this blog post, right, about test shapes. And there you see it in the book by Jay Fields, Working Effectively with Unit Tests. You see you have 2 types of tests. You have the social tests, which are often the test that unit relies on other units to fulfill its behavior, right? But I'm not stubbing it away. I'm using it as a whole unit, a unit of work, a unit test. So I'm using everything and I'm not using any mocks. Now the other one here is the solitary test. That's the strategy I used at the start, right? I have one unit, one class. I stop and prefer to isolate that tested unit. And you see, I mocked it away. And both of these has side effects, right? Think about the connectedness and isolation again. And we need to manage that. There's no one approach here that we can take. Take the approach that solves the purpose. And a good friend of mine, Thomas Pierrat, he says, and the goal here is to look at the outside in and have proper acceptance tests, coarse-grained, connected unit tests, right? Which is in the middle. And we might go fine-grained in the unit tests, which are more the solitary tests, right? But first of all, we go here. And then in the end, we might do some contract test, integration tests between our systems. But as long as our acceptance tests, which are coarse-grained unit tests, work, I'm fine. Now, where do we do this on? Well, we're in domain-driven design community. So if you look at the bounded context, it has a model for a purpose. It is a unit of consistent language. We can do tests on here, right? Tests are also part of that bounded context. The bounded context language is represented in the tests, as well as in the code, as well as what we speak, etc., etc. So how would that look is, let's say in the middle, and I'm using a hexagonal or ports and adapters architecture, but in the middle, I have my domain model represented in code, right? With objects in this case. I'm an object-oriented programmer. You can do this functional as well. It doesn't really matter, but the model is exposed in code. And what you see is at the top, I have my acceptance test. And my acceptance test will run on the port that goes inside the domain. And then I mock away every object or every connection that's outside my domain model. I'll mock that away. And now my acceptance scenario will test my full domain. And these are really the sociable tests from the highest level. And when we go deeper, you'll see that, well, maybe this one object here is really complex. So I need to create a solitary test. And maybe that object is really complex. So I make a solitary test, right? And maybe these 3 objects together is the aggregate. So I also make a more sociable test there, right? So as you see, there's no one strategy. For me, the goal is to have these acceptance scenario run against my domain model. And that's my end goal. As long as these succeed, it's fine. But of course, these has long feedback. That's the downside of it. So I need to go in depth. So how would that look in our polarity map again? Here you see the solitary test on the left. You see the sociable test on the right. And there you can say, Now, the good thing about a solitary test, I tested in isolation, fast feedback on failure. But if I go to the negative, it's cascading changes on mocks and stubs and the loss of unit of work cohesiveness, right? So we can fix that with the sociable tests, which are coherent, no mocking or coupler, but failure of bug in other classes and slower feedback of failure, right? Balance. We need to constantly balance these two. And I'll later describe how we can balance this, right? But as you can see on the top, my goal is to feeling secure to change the code. And my fear is cascading changes. So as you can see, there's no one way. And if we look at autonomy again, right, autonomy sits now in the middle. How can I get these two into balance? Now, then let's go to autonomy in teams. And there's this individual and interaction over processes and tools, right? An individual can be autonomous and so can be a team. A team is a collection of individuals that can either work as one autonomous team or as a group of autonomous individuals. Well, like language and meanings would be crucial. The nuance here is crucial. So we have to break it to you, but we are in the end all herd animals that really, really need to be liked by other people and get that confirmation. It's been described in cultural anthropology a lot, in sociology, and as soon as we start talking about relationships and things get personal, we get uncomfortable. That's the problem. We might feel unsafe because rejection is around the corner. That's why we love our precise technical problems so much, right? I don't have to deal with other people. But the thing here is isolation in a person is not good for a person, right? We identify ourselves through others. So we need to have that herd feeling. We need to have that feeling that we belong to someone. There's actually a lot of tests. One test that went on in the United States when they still isolate people in prison, right? When they had bad behavior and they figure out it didn't work, they didn't self-reflect because they couldn't reflect. Because in order to reflect, you need the other, right? You need that connectiveness. So there's the paradox. We want to be autonomous, but at the same time, we want to belong to a group of people. When we act as a group of autonomous individuals and don't feel like a herd, we lose that feeling of belonging, right? And in perceived individual and autonomy and perceived team element, what works for any team differs. That's really context depending on a team, same as all my bounded contexts are context dependent, and what works depends on that. But they have to be on the same page, because otherwise things can get messy and we can turn into a dictatorship, right? So imagine you have a nice development team working on a product, everyone is doing their job, but there's one person that seems to call all the shots. That can be a tech lead, that can be the person that's the longest there. It's probably the person with the most knowledge. That person has undocumented knowledge, most likely, and that's a problem. This person can be brilliant and building the best product, but it's a huge risk, right? So in the Netherlands, they call it the bus factor. I would now rather like to call it the lottery factor. So a colleague told me that. So if this person would win the lottery, person is gone from a team, what now? But on the other hand, you know, it can also be nice to have a lead developer making decisions. Again, we are herd animals, and sometimes we like the dog making the decision for us. Guide us, right? Guide us to our home. So what we have here is an autonomous team with one autonomous individual that has most power, which can lead to undesired behavior. And that can grow because we don't want to lose that person. We get dependent on that person, right? You get the downside of the lemniscate here, of the polarity. And if we don't switch and we don't manage that, it becomes worse and worse and worse. The person can work in isolation because we assume the person is doing the right thing. Meanwhile, you have an autonomous team where stuff is lurking beneath the surface. This can grow and eventually explode. Leadership needs to turn that ship around, right? It's leadership that need to manage that. Again, we need to do some sense making to see where are we at, and we need to be able to talk about it. Define the boundaries. What do we expect of each other in terms of domains, teams, but most importantly, about what it means in terms of behavior as an individual and as a member. So because autonomy is a bulk concept, it can be misused. Like I said, dictatorship is a potential risk, but we've also seen autonomy being used as an excuse, as a means to shift the blame to someone else. Example, an organization read about autonomous teams, want to do it, maybe microservices, right? And there's your first flag. Don't just copy paste stuff because it works for someone else. Watch on one of our previous talks to talk about that and about cargo coding and the copy paste hell that's mutating. But one very important note here is that culture is crucial. Surprise. Within this particular organization, there was fear of being held accountable, distrust, no room for failure, and a lot of pressure. So for the teams, autonomy sounded pretty good because it would get some of the pressure off, or so they assumed. For management, autonomy sounded good because they interpreted that as full responsibility with the teams, which was good for their cover your ass culture, right? It took long for this to clash, deadlines missed, no clear communication, and lessons learned. Moving toward autonomy because it works somewhere else or because it might help you cover your ass, won't bring you anything, sounds trivial, but this happens. You need someone to expose this behavior and consequences. In the case of organization, it was us doing that. Instead of focusing on autonomy, we started with building trust and create a shared meaning. We need a shared meaning. We need a shared purpose. And this is what Drive, Mr. Pink also said, right? We need a purpose. And well, what do you know? Domain-driven design and the bounded context can help you with that. Because a bounded context is a model for a specific purpose. We know this is what we do it for. This is what we build it for this customer, we're building this model, right? And then we can use things like context mapping in domain-driven design to see the connectedness with other teams, which we're going to talk about that later. And within something Nick Tune at the DDD grew up is this bounded context canvas where you can describe that description, right? This is really nice because now together with the team, we collaboratively model our purpose together and we see what are our inbound and outbound communication. And this is how we stay connected and define these bounded context boundaries. But it's not only about boundaries, it's also the way we develop our work. And one thing I see in each phase of each sorts of programming, and now you'll see load code popping up, is that people have a problem. Here it says application teams grows, it slows down because multiple developers compete to change the same code. First of all, I don't see that as a problem. I see that as, oh, maybe we need to talk together and see how this fits together. But they see it as a problem. And that's the thing, right? It's not a problem. So what do? They actually deliver at different pace. So they're going to do branching. Nice. You get a branch. You get a branch. Everyone gets a branch. Well, do you hear the isolation coming in here, right? Just working your isolated thing on your own purpose and you'll lose connection. There's no balance here. So what you will see in that thing is that the feedback is late, right? So this is Git flow, by the way. And as you can see, is if this is the main line, you see there's no real feedback here because this happened and, you know, long feedback. And that can cause to sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've been working on this code a really long time, right? And someone else would say, well, yeah, but that's not what we discussed. I mean, I thought it would be a different design and connect it differently. Okay, let's just take some duct tape and fix that and we'll call it technical debt, which it's not, it's craft. There's slow feedback, you wasn't connected. And to show that again on the polarity map, you'll see, right, the branch gives you freedom, individual creativity, but you have loss of cohesive mental models. Well, you know, bounded context is a shared model. So we're losing that the longer we're on the branch. But the positive effect of the trunk-based, so let's say we do only mainline development, is care for the whole, shared mental model, team effort. But we have excessive conformity. So trunk-based, people see trunk-based as being only on the trunk, which is not. You can use branches. And how would we check that is, look, when we observe our team and we see people competing to change the same code, maybe we need to start pairing or mobbing, right? And at some point you can find signals that you're too long on that main line. Then we go back and find the branch, right? Balance. There's no one way to do it. Don't go on, and this is not trunk-based development as defined, right? In trunk-based development, you can do branching. It's not about only committing on the mainline code. You could do branching, but don't take one approach over the other. So don't always take the trunk-based development, or I mean mainline commits, and don't always take the branching commits. Balance it. Choose every time what you're going to need. So then to my favorite topic, which is autonomy between teams. I already talked about it with the context map. So how does my team relate to the other? And people think, well, let's do bounded context, microservices, so we have autonomy. And there again, we can go towards isolation again. Yeah. So in this case, autonomy between teams, microservices, and can go on to a lot more, can lead to the ivory towers, to the silos. And that's not what we want. So one thing that happened a few years ago is this book called Team Topology that came out, right? And Team Topology really loves domain-driven design. While Team Topology is about teams and about fast flow, organizing business and technology teams for fast flow of their teams, domain-driven design is about autonomy in models, right? And these really work well together because these teams for fast flow will be owners of these models, and the models has relationship with each other. And that's what I'm going to talk about really quickly. Is if you look at what they describe, the 4 fundamental team topology is you have these, perhaps a platform team. You don't always need a platform team, but let's say you need. But in the end, it's about this middle team, the stream-aligned team, right? The stream-aligned team is picking up value for the customer and releasing it in a fast flow. And because they cannot do that always by themselves, because there's this thing called cognitive load, because that's what we should think about, right? About limiting the size of software, services, and product to the cognitive load that the team can handle. So the stream-aligned team could be in a lot of complexity. Well, one thing I'll talk about later is the enabling team, right? Where you need some new technology, some new testing framework, perhaps, or a new database technology. Then another team can help you periodically to implement that. But a team can also be accountable for one big ball of mud bounded context, right? And that can be complex. And they will put on another team. And that's what we don't want. We don't want 2 teams working on the same, well, context in that way, because they use different languages. And that's what we don't want. So what do we do? Because we cannot put one team on it because the cognitive load is too high. Now, again, domain-driven design can give you an answer here. Eric Evan described this. There's no one way of doing it. We don't all want bounded context with anti-corruption layers on it and just be isolated. No, in this case, what we could start doing is form a partnership. Clearly define 2 bounded contexts within that big ball of mud, see if we can do that, and set up a cooperative relationship between the 2 teams. And these teams establish a process for coordinating planning of development. So you lose a bit of autonomy here, but you decrease the cognitive load. Yeah? And that's what domain-driven design is all about. It's about trade-off. None of these strategic patterns are by default bad. They just are, right? Even the confirmation pattern, people say the confirmation strategic pattern can be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be. It's about trade-offs. So don't think about the utopia that every bounded context is autonomous. No, that's not what it is. There's these several patterns Eric Evans clearly described, and there's more after it that you can use. And it's all about that balance. And I was already talking about that enabling team, right? So we have the stream-aligned team, and they can form partnership with other stream-aligned teams, and they need a platform team. Maybe there's a complicated subsystem team. This, like, for instance, we need some data science for doing our stream-aligned team. But then we go to this enabling team, right? I already told you about the enabling team. But the thing about enabling teams, there's a danger here. If we just set an enabling team, like for instance, a test team or a architectural team, right? And we need to manage that they actively avoid becoming ivory towers of knowledge, dictating technical choices for other teams to follow. This is what we usually see as a pattern. We have an architectural team dictating technical choices, or a testing team in isolation dictating this. And here's this brilliant comic agile, right? That says there's one team is constantly delivering a huge number of features. Well, nobody's using it anymore. We got to stay connected. An architectural team in isolation is that ivory tower team. They're not helping teams. An enabling team is a supporting team there to help the other teams. And they have an end date. What's the purpose of that enabling team, right? Because what happens usually if we stay in that isolation, right? They have freedom, they can go fast, it's nice, work ahead of new technology, they have uniqueness. But if they stay too long in that isolation, they have loss of equality, isolation, they will become selfish, but they will also get the downside of the collaboration, right? They themselves will get high cognitive load. They themselves will get excessive conformity and sameness. And this is how a polarity works as well. If you stay too long in one polarity, you get the bad of the both. Yeah, and you're becoming that Tower of Babel instead of customer-centric. And enabling teams, customer, here are the stream-aligned teams. And then let's talk about my second favorite topic after branching is, of course, the scaled agile frameworks, which has their place and which can be implemented correctly. But what I see here is a lot of isolation patterns, right? So we need to manage this. We need to manage the connectiveness and the relationship through these polarity maps. So autonomy in organization. So let's talk about this last level, right? Autonomy in an organization, which is again a continuous negotiation. And this sounds somewhat paradoxical, right? An autonomous organization, but this organization consists of autonomous teams, individuals, or maybe there's no autonomy at all. The thing is, it's a continuous negotiation. What do we mean with autonomy in organization? Where do we need provide autonomy, and what does it bring? What does autonomy mean for the way we collaborate? What's my role? All very important questions to consider in this context, right? And let's start with vision, boundaries, or both. Let's start about remembering the thing we said about boundaries and vision in the beginning of the talk. Define the boundaries in the shape of a vision is what teams should do. The vision comes from leadership. What I hear when there's need for the vision within team is in fact a call for boundary. Tell us what the boundaries are in which we can decide how to work. This is also a job for a software architect, right? We define the boundaries, constraints for innovation. We don't decide how people do it. So if you want something to be done as a leader, you set the boundaries. This is what I want, and what do you need for it? So basically, that's what leadership should do, right? So people saying, if we all have autonomous teams, we don't need leadership anymore. Yes, we do. They manage these polarities. And there's a difference between the old school Machiavelli leaders, right? It's command and control. It's ends justify the means. And what you see nowadays is a shift towards the collaborative leadership, right? They set boundaries, they set constraints, they make sure that the autonomous teams stay connected with each other. And this is leadership, this is middle management, and this is architects that might sit in between the teams. And I say in between the teams and not above the teams because they're equal, right? And there's where autonomy sits. It's not a free pass. It still requires conversation, right? That's what we need. We need someone to create these connectiveness and create these conversations. And we cannot stress enough, better collaboration, direct communication is not behavior. If we want to expect something from a team, it needs to be observable, right? It needs to say what outcome, not output, so not task, what outcome can I expect from you? Well, Evelyn can talk a lot about that. She's unfortunately not here, but she will discuss that in a different talk later on. What exactly is behavior and how could we do it? So direct communication is not behavior. So who calls the shot? I already told you that with autonomy, it can be confusing who gets to call the shot, which makes a decision, which decision are you allowed to make? That's a hard question in general, but especially when there's autonomous team, it has to be made explicit, which again is a continuous negotiation. Boundaries, this is I got from the brilliant Ruth Malan and from Jay Bloom, boundaries you create in negotiation. Yeah, it's a continuous negotiation. There are no hard boundaries usually. They're not really hard. They're not fixed. It's a continuous negotiation. If a boundary is fixed, it's called a wall. It's not a boundary anymore. So if you agree about what autonomy means, what you can expect from each other and where the boundaries are, you can also determine who gets to make the decision, who is responsible for what. Eventually, leadership calls the shot, obviously, ranking and budgets. But there have to be that continuous negotiation with the teams and people in the organization. It's up to leadership to collaborate on that thing, right? Collaborate leadership. That's the thing we need. If we have autonomous teams, we cannot have a person on top who do a Machiavelli type of dictator leadership. They don't match, unfortunately. It's a negotiation, it's a skill. Now, we gave them autonomy, and why aren't they doing anything with it, right? And that's the frustration on most leadership teams. They're like, we gave them that. So why is no one taking ownership and responsibility? I asked them to turn around that question. What can you do to help them take that ownership? Because it's not like you say, well, here's your ownership, go. That person also needs to be able to feel okay to take that ownership, right? So that's the question you should have asked to the team. Do you want ownership? How do you want it? Again, here you see the negotiation, right? And this polarity map will help you. It's that task of the leadership to make sure and manage these polarities of autonomy and connectedness and isolation, right? So what's holding them back? What they're afraid of? Which risks do they see? And that's collaborative leadership style, right? It's setting visions. It's setting, this is where we want to go with the company. What do you need for it? How do we set the boundaries? How do we set the structure together that works for you? Again, please don't copy paste any Spotify model that doesn't exist anyway. What does the team need? Which boundaries? And that's context specific. Don't come with a maturity model. Maturity model, learning is not linear. It's context dependent, as we know in domain-driven design. That's why we have the bounded context. So when there's autonomy everywhere, do we still need managers? I already tell you, managers, we still need them, but they can exist in several roles or forms. That's again, depending on your company. But I believe middle management is a crucial role for setting the strategy, right? Higher management is about option, middle management is about strategy. Jay Bloom really described this well. If you have a football team, you have the people above on the top, they set options, but really who sets the strategy is the coach, right? It's the middle manager, so to say. And that's how we should perceive it as well. There needs to be a shift. And they're in the middle, they have a hard job, but managers still exist. They need to change their behavior as well, from a Machiavelli style to a collaborative style. So how would that look like in a polarity map? So Jay Bloom actually doesn't call it agency. He calls it, or autonomy, he calls it agency. That's what we want, right? It's the balance between decentralized decision and centralized decision. And if we don't balance these two, then we get into indecisiveness. So centralized decision means empowering to the group can coordinate, group can actively decide, and everyone feels included. That's centralized decision by a manager, right? But the problem here is that we can have queues, we can be dependent on these decisions. We have lack of individual accountability, no creativity or spontaneity, and disempowering to the individual. So we also want to have decentralized decision. And again, it's a Lemniscat, right? Which is empowering the individually, it's spontaneous, and it's individual acting decisively. But the problem with this central decision is that the group cannot coordinate, they get fear of missing out, and burden of consequences. So we need that middle management with sort of like a team topology style, managing these polarities, managing the connectiveness between the team. We need to have software architects either in the team as a virtual team together, working on that context map. How do the models relate to each other? How does the autonomy in the team come together, right? And one thing to be aware of is that patterns of autonomy and isolation are fractal. If you have isolated patterns at the top, you will find them in the bottom as well. They go and cascade down to your organization. So if you see an isolated pattern inside the team, probably what you will see is that the managers are isolation, there's no feedback. This is what I usually find weird in this organization, is that a middle manager doesn't get any feedback from the teams. End of the year performance, there's no feedback from the teams. And for me, that's weird because the middle manager is there to set strategies, constraints, and vision collaboratively with the team. So who could decide that they're doing their job correctly? It's mostly, in my opinion, the team, and of course their leadership. Did they help create that vision of the company? So autonomy, is that what we really, really want? Well, we need to define and negotiate boundaries continuously, and we need to manage the polarities. And that's the end of the talk. I hope you enjoyed. And we always say, please leave the judging to the cats. The left ones are mine. As you saw before, these are my cats. And unfortunately, Evelyn isn't here, but she'll be happy that her cat is brilliantly displayed on this talk again, as we always do. So we have a Twitter account, both of us. Please feel free to DM us or tweet us. We have an email, we have a website. And if you want to contact us, let us know. Thank you very much for having me here so far. And hopefully there's some questions I can answer now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, your sharing. And our audience have some question in Slido, so I need to share my screen. Wait a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kenny, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, the first question is, can you explain more about the social technical? Because I think it is very abstracted concept.
Yeah, so I don't consider myself the expert on social technical. I know a few people who are. So this is my explanation. Social technical considered, and please follow Trond or Jay Bloom and Ruth Malan. They can explain this a lot better. But here's my view on it. Usually what you see in companies is that we only take account the technical. So the way I describe it, let's say if you work in the office and if you're back at the office again due to Corona, we live inside or we might work inside a open office plan, right? So we all work in one open office plan. And if I go to companies and I see them using this, and that's a technical design, right? That's the technical design of the open office plan. It's correct. We can put everyone there, technically brilliant. But when we look at the social part, which is actually two parts, is the cognitive part and which is the social part, which is a difference. You'll see that how does the interaction go? So they try to use this technical design to improve communication, but they saw it work at someone else. Now they put it inside their company. And what you will see is that at most open office spaces, actually everything went down except the costs, right? So the communication goes down because we all have these nice headphones on, because we're all getting too much noise and cognitive load, right? There's too much cognition going on. I get too much inside. So social, it goes down again. And these two interact with each other, as you will see in this open office plan. Now, the open office plan works because people collaboratively designed them. So where it worked, they designed that together. So there's a brilliant talk by Joe Wright at Lean Agile Scotland talking about the history of it. And there it worked. Why? Because they took the social in account, and the social is more of like towards the culture part, the cognition. So they looked, what are your needs? What are your social needs? And what's the behavior inside here? And let's collaboratively design this open office space. There it worked. And then you saw other companies copy pasting that because they saw it improved. Technically, it improved the communication, it improved blah, 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 blah. So they thought, okay, let's technically move it away as a design in my company, but they neglected the social part. And the same goes inside your software development as an architect, right? If you develop these autonomous system or microservices, you need to take into account the social part. Within domain-driven design, you see that the strategic patterns are really social patterns, most of them, right? The partnership I talked about, that's really a social pattern. How do we interact with each other? And usually we just take in account, okay, let's just split these software in hard boundaries, but we don't take into account what does that happen to the culture, the team dynamics. And that's why team topology, the strategic patterns get more important now. Doesn't need to say that the tactical isn't important. They need to be in balance. So I hope that answers the question. This is how I see it, but please, there's multiple people who can talk about this in the scene. And I always start at Ruth Malan. I'll check that in the chat. She's already, I don't know how long in the architecture world, and she's a brilliant explainer.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. And the second question is, do you think the level of autonomy should be given depends on people's maturity, but will that slow down people's growth to become mature?
Yeah, so here's again, it's the polarity, right? What can my team do now? And that's an open discussion with the team, right? This is what the purpose is. We want to grow towards here. Where do you feel comfortable with taking autonomy here, right? So autonomy, you can give it to a team, but it also means that the team wants to have that autonomy. Some people are afraid maybe to get that autonomy. But if you keep that stable, that balance stable, yes, people won't grow to become mature. So that's only the skill you want to constantly manage as a manager, right? Or as an architect. That's the polarity map. So that's the continuous improvement that you can embed in your software development flow is, okay, where can we get more autonomy and what do we need for it? A good thing, maturity mapping it's called. So usually what we do is have a maturity model in our learning, but you can also do maturity mapping, which is based on wordly mapping. And there you can go context dependent. How can we grow as a, where's the boundaries and how can we grow as a team towards that more maturity, right? But context dependent for our team. So it can be that one person has all the information about that new technology. Let's say we do serverless, there's one person who's brilliant at it, but the rest not. Okay, what strategy will we take now to make sure other people will do it? So pairing, mobbing, and then 4 weeks later, you do it again, or 2 weeks later, and you constantly keep sense making to see how is it going now and how can we change now. So it's not a static concept. It's a team dynamic. Heidi Heinfeld has a brilliant book about team dynamics. It's ever evolving. It's not static.
Thank you for your answer. And the next question is, how can we distinguish systems that have full autonomy from those with particular autonomies?
Wow, that's a really good question I need to think about. So how can we distinguish systems that have full autonomy from... So it depends, right? First of all, do you want to have full autonomy and what does it mean? So for me, I'd rather have agency. If I get a job, I can fulfill it myself. I can have the mastery and purpose to do it myself. That's what Mr. Pink talks about. And if someone couldn't do that and needs someone else, then it's partial autonomy. And the strategic patterns can help there in DDD to map these out, right? What's the level of maturity and is that okay? Or I mean, what's the level of autonomy and is that okay in this given context? For instance, if I'm working in a core domain model, right? I might want to have more autonomy because I need to iterate on that model a lot. If I'm in a supportive domain model, maybe I'm okay with having less autonomy. So that would be the first question. And I'm okay with a more tight partnership between teams because I don't have to go that fast in that parts of the software structure. So I would do probably, the too long didn't read, do some context mapping on the current system and then map the DDD strategic patterns on them and see, and these strategic patterns are on a scale of autonomy themselves, right? So for instance, the confirmation pattern is like low autonomy. The anti-corruption layer is a bit higher autonomy, but there's a different scale as well. That's how I would do it, context mapping.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the final question is, anonymous coding, more or less autonomy?
Well, there's the balance again. And that's the conversation you need to have with you and your team, right? So usually what I do is we pick up a new, for instance, a user story or something new. I start with the connectiveness, right? Let's do maybe some mob programming this morning. Let's figure out together how we want to design this. Then we mob that. And while we're mobbing, we're creating a shared mindset and connectiveness. But, you know, we cannot maintain that for a long time. It's the tight balance again. So what I do at some point, people are clear enough and they say, okay, you can do this, you can do that, and I can do this. Everyone will code, but never work on their own branch. They will just keep committing to the same main branch then. So everyone stays connected. So people will say, how about code reviews, right? They say, I need to go on a branch because I need to have a PR. For me, a review is continuous. So if people will just commit on the main line, then if I start developing and I want to commit on main line, I need to pull their commits. I see what they did. If I see something that is like, oh, this is not what I expected, I will go back and talk to them again. And that's the Lemniscat, right? So what are the signals that you are going towards isolation or towards too much sameness? And that's the balance you need to talk to as a team in that polarity map. So look at polarity mapping. Me, Gien, and Evelyn talked about it on the event store. So I'll share that blog post later, and start doing that with your team. So you get that trigger. Oh, this is not what I expect. Let's pair up again.